Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Inside Pima County with Supervisor Rex Scott. I am Supervisor Rex Scott, and we are going to take a little diversion from talking with program and department directors within the county, and we're welcoming to the show today the Executive Director for the Pima Association of Governments Regional Council and the Regional Transportation Authority, and that is Mr. Mike Ortega. Mike, welcome.
Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
All right. Delighted to have you. And Mike and I got to know each other when he was the city manager for the City of Tucson. And, of course, the county and the city have a lot of engagement with each other, being the two big kids on the block. And he was unanimously appointed to be the new PAG RTA Executive Director, and delighted with that decision. Wanted to ask if you could tell our viewers and listeners, because we have people, Mike, who watch us on YouTube as well as listen to us on a variety of podcast platforms. Tell us about your professional journey and what brought you to this point.
Okay. Well, I appreciate that question. So I have actually been in this business, if you will, of government for well over 30 years now. And I started out as an engineer. I started out as a civil engineer, a registered professional engineer, doing projects. I did projects for the city and the county back in government. And then decided to put my toe in government. So I went to work for Pima County. So I actually worked for Pima County for a few years, for 4 years. I worked in the Department of Transportation Flood Control at that time. So I'll date myself a little bit. But then decided to go back into the private sector, and I was a project manager in Southern California for a bit. Then moved back to Douglas, my hometown, born and raised in Douglas. Went back as a public works director. And then the manager left, city manager left, and the mayor council came and asked that would you be interested in city manager, and I said, never done that, but I'll give it my best shot. So I did. I did that for almost 12 years. And so that was a great experience. Also met and did stint at the state engineer for ADOT. So I was the state's highest ranking, if you will, engineer for the entirety of the state transportation system. Then went back to Cochise County and the Douglas and became the county manager for Cochise County. And I did that for a few years, and then heard about an opportunity in Tucson to be the city manager. So I threw my hat in the ring. And I know after 9 years, decided to go on to something else. And so I wanted to do some sawdust in my workshop and play with my grandkid. That was my goal. And a few months ago, several months ago now, the RTA board called. Said, hey, would you come in and give us a hand? We got something I think that we'd like to work on. And so I said, happy to help out, give it my best shot, doing that.
So your professional, your academic background is in engineering. You don't have a background academically in public policy or public administration. What is it about having that engineering background that has helped you to perform at a high level in so many of these public policy positions?
Yeah, it's a great question. And actually, I've been asked that over the years. What I will tell you is I've never taken a public policy class. I've never taken any kind of training in political science or any of that. My formal training as I mentioned, it's engineering. It was structural engineering, actually. And then I have a master's in business with an emphasis in accounting, so I like numbers.
Okay.
But I think what it did, that formal training, that engineering training, really gives you the opportunity to take very, very complex problems and break them down into solvable chunks. And so if you really look at any kind of engineering, it takes a macro level problem and starts to dissect it into its component parts, which then become more solvable. And then you're solving them, but you have to keep in mind bigger the goal, if you will, solving the bigger problem. But then you break it down into all individual pieces. Well, so they're manageable, they're bite-sized, if you will, manageable pieces. I think that formal training has really helped. And it also helps that I can talk the language of pavement and, structural components of pavement and engineering and design and curves and all of that stuff. I honestly understand that. Yeah.
I would imagine that approach to different policy problems and projects that you may be dealing with is also really helpful in terms of dealing with the many different types of people, especially us high maintenance elected officials that you have to deal with in this job.
High maintenance as well, I would just say. But I will tell you, absolutely, and part of my background, which I didn't talk about, is really a shout out to my parents. Because they were very much sticklers for customer service. When I was really young, my mom ran a small gift shop in Douglas.
Mm-hmm.
We all had to work, all the kids worked there. So we swept, we mopped, we washed windows, we did all of the restocking. It was just a very small little gift shop. But we were taught about customer service. We were taught about everyone who walks in the door has to greet it, you greet it professionally, and the customer is always right. Kind of like elected officials, right?
There you go. Yes. Yeah, we can tend in that direction.
So I think that really helps, though, in terms of a foundation for what that relationship with folks, just in general, how you treat people with respect. But you're also open. You're open to suggestions. You're open to explaining things in language that translates well for folks that maybe are technical or aren't, well versed in government speak. And so you have to find that language that resonates.
So tell us a little bit about both the Pima Association of Governments and the Regional Transportation Authority, and what was it about the work that happens within those two entities that convinced you to come out of your very brief retirement?
I appreciate that, Supervisor. So first of all, the Pima Association of Governments, it's considered a metropolitan planning organization or council of governments, and originally formed in the mid-1990s. The idea there was to gather folks in a formal setting across the region so that everyone in the region is represented on this, we'll call it macro level planning organization. And the idea, quite frankly, is that representation translates into how regional decisions are made, particularly when it comes to transportation funding from the federal government and even the state government. And so that planning foundation, if you will, becomes the opportunity for a lot of different conversations. We have environmental, sound, air quality, those kinds of things. But we also talk a lot about what other roles can we play. And so just recently, probably about 3 or 4 months ago, the Regional Council of TAG asked, what else can we do? What other opportunities are there out there in the state or across the nation, whereby we could maybe copy and say, hey, we should be dabbling in some of that as well.
As an MDO.
Absolutely. And so that conversation actually just happened again yesterday, something that we haven't dabbled in at all, or very much anyway. We have presentations from the Mexican government on the Port of Guaymas and the impact Port of Guaymas improvements are going to have in the Tucson region, potentially through rail and or truck traffic. And so opportunities for us to look at an inland port or supporting the Port of Tucson, which is part of our chemistry here in the region. We also had a presentation on passenger rail from Mexico City up to Malaba's port of entry, and we had an update on that from the Mexican officials. So that's something that you wouldn't necessarily think of TAG, dabble, but those are regional planning issues and opportunities for us to really look at. But the RTA is really the other piece of what we do, and the RTA has no staff. So that's a real interesting piece of this, because the PAG, or the Pima Association of Governments, provides the service to the RTA. The RTA was established in 2004 with the legislature giving authority to the county, not the government, but the region, to form an authority for the sole purpose of taxis itself to fund transportation improvements, regional transportation authority. And so that really started in 2004. And I'll talk about that in a minute here in terms of the original vote and how that came about. But basically, the RTA exists solely for that purpose. And it's provided the service, if you will, the administration by the Pima Association of Governments. The question you asked was, how did I get? What interested me in terms of having this opportunity to control? So when I got the call, actually it was in my shop, and they said, "Hey, we'd like you to consider maybe helping." And so I came down and I chatted with some folks. I talked to some board members. I talked to other folks, regional folks as well. And the more that I heard, the more that I understood the challenges that they were facing, that we are facing, that the more I started thinking about opportunities where I could help. And as I walked through my career, you asked me about my professional career, in each instance, it was really a perspective on how can I help? And do I have skill sets that might be able to help and solve whatever the challenges are that are facing that organization? And so the more I thought about it, and I talked to my family about it, because that's an important piece of that, we decided, I'll say we decided that this was something that would be not only of value to our family in terms of, very selfishly, we want the best quality of life for our family. My kids live here, my grandkids live here. We want an amazing region, we want an amazing community. And if we can do something to further that, then we should definitely step up and do that. And so, quite frankly, that was the main reason why I said, okay, thumbs up, I'll give them my best shots.
I appreciate that and all of that background about PAG and RTA and just some additional information for our listeners and viewers. The 9 members of the PAG Regional Council include the 5 mayors of our cities and towns, 1 member of the Board of Supervisors, the chair of the Tohono O'odham Nation, the chair of the Pasquayaki tribe, and then the governor's Southern Arizona representative of the State Transportation Board. Those same people are members of the RTA board. And I was the Board of Supervisors representative to the PAG Regional Council and the RTA board for 4 years. Supervisor Matt Hines has taken on that role now. But talk a little bit about the board's role in making sure that all of the projects in the first RTA plan, the one that was passed by voters in 2006, that all of those projects are successfully completed, the board's role in doing that, and how those projects will be completed if RTA Next is passed and if it isn't.
Okay. So the accountability for completion of RTA, whatever the plan is, we'll call it RTA 1, the 2006 plan, falls with the RTA board. So, and thank you for outlining the membership. I should probably have done that.
No.
Sorry to my bosses now. Right? So, but thanks for saving me. So the key piece to this, though, is that the RTA board is responsible for the implementation of the plan as approved by voters. That's kind of fundamental and basically the role that they play. So how that happened, though, is the key, right? So let's talk a little bit about if RTA Next passes, and then we'll talk about it if it doesn't. So first of all, it's important to understand the chemistry of both the RTA 1 plan and the RTA Next plan. So the chemistry of the RTA 1 plan had, we have completed over 1,000 individual projects across the entire region. And so you start to look at the entirety of that program, and there has been significant investment to the tune of about $1.6 billion across the entire region. The challenge we ran into as an RTA is we didn't bring in enough revenue. The revenue shortfall was nearly $1 billion. Now think about that for a minute. When you very simplistically look at the map there, We've invested 1.6 billion. We are having a shortfall of about $1 billion to complete all of the projects, well, all the programs that were originally approved by the voters. And there's no way to make that up. How do you make that up? Right? That's a very, very significant amount of money, amount of resource. And so the conversation then became, okay, what do we do about that? Well, we looked at the plan. First and foremost was look at the plan and what's left to complete. And we found there were 7 projects that we wanted to have a conversation around. And so we brought these as staff, we brought these to the board and said, we believe 5 projects, we should rethink the scope on. So, for example, North First Avenue between Grant and River, in the original plan was 6 lanes. It was 6-lane divided roadway. But we know, based on public feedback and analysis, we've gone through the traffic data, we've gone through the average daily traffic, and we know that only a 4-lane divide is necessary. So it would be an inefficient use of resource to build 6 lanes. Well, why would we build 6 lanes when we know today, not necessary, not needed? So we need to go back to the voter and have a conversation about that. So that's kind of the first thing, right? But the second thing, and there's 5 projects like that. 22nd Street from Keno to I-10 is about a project like that. So that's 5. There's 2 projects that we need more money for. We just don't have enough money to complete those projects given that shortfall, inflation, and all the things that I've mentioned. One is Tangerine Road, so the completion of Tangerine Road on the west end, and Grant Road on the west end. So those 2 projects.
It's the last 2 phases of Grant.
That's correct. It's the last phase, but it's pretty much stretch of Grant Road and Tangerine Road. So those 2 need additional dollars. Again, go back to the voter and say, look, here's the plan that was approved. For these reasons, you didn't make the amount of revenue, didn't take in the amount of revenue that we bought. And so as a result, we need to have a conversation around that. Okay. So if RTA next passes, those projects, as well as a variety of others, will be, we will construct those within the first period. Start them, get them designed, get them going in the first period of the new plan. But that funding is extremely important. But so is the rescoping, because we don't want to build an inefficient, we don't want to build overbuild, right? And so the conversation is, let's build what we need and what we can project today going forward. So now let's talk a little bit about what happens if it doesn't pass. We've looked at that to some level, not in a lot of detail, but we have looked at it obviously, and we do have an understanding of some of it. Some of the challenges that we're going to see is some of the transit services could be at risk. We think they will be at risk. About $30 million annually goes towards, we'll call it the augmented transit services. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about transit because I think folks think of transit as bus routes in the urban core, bus stops in the urban core. But what we found is that as we dissected it, quite frankly, I dissected it because I wanted to make sure I understood it. Only about 41% of that augments what is going on in the urban core. The rest of it is in the outer area, in suburban areas. And so when you start looking at dial-ride, you start looking at paratransit, those services are at risk if RTA doesn't, in those suburban areas, in those outer areas. And I will be honest, I don't think people really understood that. I will tell you, I didn't understand it in my prior life as city manager. I didn't understand the chemistry of that. And so, quite frankly, I made a lot of noise about it. People need to know that we have gotten used to this funding source from RTA now, from RTA 1, that could go away. Those services could go away or be radically reduced. Now, I can tell you that some folks might look at that and say, well, he's just trying to scare us. And that I can tell you I don't do business that way, number one. But number two, I really looked at all of the opportunities, at least ones I could think of, and some that I hadn't thought of, others did, including could Pima County step up? Could Pima County, have some sales tax? That takes a unanimous vote. I personally went around and talked to the members of the board. That is probably unlikely.
Highly unlikely, strikingly unlikely.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. I didn't want to, but definitely. I went through and looked at the county bond and go through that exercise. Found out that that's a great idea if we were building a road or something at a capital level. But for operations of the transit system, it's not an option because you can't use those bonded funding from bonds for operations. So then the other thought I had is, well, just raise property tax, right? That's an easy thing, right? But I also know that from my prior life as the county manager at Cochise, that's only 2% plus new construction on an annual basis, which barely, if that, keeps up with inflation on your cost of operation. And what that means is, if you were to try to fund, you know that you would have to make decisions to cut somewhere else. And so basically, I've explored those and others. A question I've been asked is, well, what about the use of fund balance? Right? The RTA has a fund balance for these projects that are kind of in the wings. Right?
That fund balance is already committed to the RTA 1 project.
Absolutely. It is committed to those projects, some of which are under contract now. But the other piece to it is, and we'll go down this path down the road, but ultimately, the funds that were collected for that 20-year period provided a 20-year service for that transit service. The projects that were identified for the road component have not been completed for all the reasons that we've spoken. And so those dollars need to go towards completion of that, which goes back to your point about, what is the process for completion. Now, what I will tell you is that the way the statutes work, if the voters turn it down, the RTA board can then make a decision on how to utilize the remaining money to complete the program, i.e. those projects, which means that some of those projects could be risked because there's just not enough money for that. And so it could very well be that some of those projects don't get completed and don't get funded unless there's other sources of funding. And those sources will not be available based on that commitment after 29.
I know when I was serving on the PAG Regional Council and the RTA board, there was unanimous belief that we would use a combination of local funds and regional funds that come in from the state and federal government to make sure that all of those RTA 1 projects are completed, even if RTA next doesn't pass. Indeed, a previous regional council had made the determination, I think it was in 2014, that all regional funds would be used to make up for the shortfall in RTA revenues coming out of the Great Recession. I would anticipate that the PAG Regional Council / RTA board would have to consider making use of those regional funds yet again, which means for our listeners and viewers that those regional funds are not going to be used for other infrastructure needs within Southern Arizona.
That's exactly correct. And you hit it right on the head. And that's why I said it's committed through 2029. Right. After that, I think the conversation's going to be really tough because there are other needs. And those regional funds were intended for those other needs, which have not been addressed now for many years, well, since 2014. And so for nearly 15 years, those dollars have not been available, and the region has suffered for it. And everybody understands when you have a reduction in revenue, you got to do what you need to get the project or the program delivered. But I think that if there's a conversation after 2030, I think it's going to be tough to put more regional funds to complete projects that are that basically have been turned down,
and will likely not only require the dedicated use of a large portion, if not all, of those regional funds, but will require more commitment from the various jurisdictions.
Exactly, and that it will be the entire region that's making that.
Yes. So we talked going into this podcast that because we're producing the podcast using government resources, we can't speak to any position for or against RTA Next. But when I came on to the Regional Council and the RTA Board in 2021, the Citizens Advisory Committee, which had been formed by the previous board and regional council was meeting. And there were two words that we heard from them a lot. And those concerns were also echoed by members of the regional council and the RTA board. Speak to how RTA Next tries to address the issues of flexibility and accountability.
Yeah, great question. So let's talk about flexibility first, because I think that's important. So a couple things on the way that the plan was established, the RTA Next plan was established first and foremost. So the 2006 plan was established based on what we call the baseline projection of revenue. So we actually hired the Eller School to run scenarios for us for what a sales tax would be in terms of revenue over the course of 20 years. There were three options: optimistic, baseline, and pessimistic. We chose, as a region, is a baseline. Yes, okay. So we learned a lesson, right? The probability of that happening was 50%. Well, after the Great Recession and all that, COVID and so forth, we know that we didn't make that, right? We were very optimistic, and we can't fault that, because I think we all were. We were all optimistic that sure, revenues will rebound and we'd be okay. All right. Well, the new plan, the RTA Next plan, picks the pessimistic level, which is significant because that has between 20 and 25% probability of occurring, right? So that means that there's 80% probability it won't occur, meaning we'll exceed that level. But that's a good thing. So right out of the chute, that provides flexibility in terms of not having our backs against the wall when or if revenues are less than what we're projecting. But there's also language that the the RTA board can make decisions about scopes and how those dollars are expended within the plan element. So they can't move money. They can't take money from the road to fund safety or run roads or any of that, which was one of the pieces that I think is extremely important to give flexibility to the board based on unforeseen conditions. So that's really important, number one. But number two, it doesn't mean they have a blank slate that they can do whatever they want. Absolutely not. The scopes and the overall scopes and the overall spirit and intent is sacred, because that's what we take to the voter. However, what we have learned is after the first 5 years and before the last 2 years, we can go back to the voter and have a conversation and say, hey, we made all of these assumptions. They're not panning out. We need to have a different conversation with the voter. And so that form of accountability, if you will, is built in, because now we know that we can go back to the voter. And that flexibility, quite frankly, is going back to the voter. Now, let's talk about how we get there and what that accountability really looks like. So what I've suggested to the board, and we're putting together now, are quarterly updates. Those quarterly updates are not just, here's a big, thick report, read at your leisure. And by the way, I really appreciate you always read your materials, so thank you for doing that. But it really gives an opportunity for the technical management committee, which are the technicians, if you will, the technical managers of the region, all of the municipalities, the nation, tribe.
And we changed the membership of the technical management committee to ensure greater participation by the city and the county, because we are the two largest governments. I think there's 3 TMC members from the city, 2 from the county, and 1 from each of the other jurisdictions.
Yes.
Okay.
Extremely important. So very, very important group. And that group is advisory to the board. So one of the things that we've changed is in the reporting structure. That group used to report directly to the executive director, which would then report to the board. And I said, no, that means that accountability, that advisory role needs to be the RTA board, not filtered by the executive director or any staff member. So that's number one. But number two, which quite frankly, no offense to my TFC buddies, but is extremely important, and that's the Citizens Accountability for Regional Transportation Committee, or CART Committee, which is made up of citizens within the region. Again, the chemistry of that has been updated, and so now there are 4 voices for the City of Tucson. that are on that for appointments, including one that has expertise in transit. And so that quarterly analysis, that quarterly review is an opportunity to ask tough questions. This isn't a let's look and make sure that we're on schedule and we're on track. This is let's make sure that the entirety of the program for 20 years is on track. And that's both schedule and financial. Because remember, going back to the accountability of the voter, right? We want to make sure that that's happening in a very open and public manner. And if we see challenges, say in the 7th year, or we're only in the 3rd year, now decide to be thinking about, okay, what are we going to do with that challenge that we see coming? And the potential for having a discussion with the voter, going back to the voter and have it said, hey, this is not going, and here's a conversation to have. That will happen quarterly. And that forward-looking component is as extreme, it's as important as anything we're doing, because that will give the board, in a public setting, a real-time report that we're looking at and projecting. What does that look like? What are the challenges that we're seeing? With the recommendation to both that citizens oversight group as well as that technical management group, so that they can then say, hey, you know what? We've got some challenges. So when you ask me about flexibility, there's flexibility. There's some flexibility that goes in. You ask me about accountability, it's airtight. In my opinion, that will give hopefully the board and the public absolute confidence in how we're going to deliver this program.
So it sounds like with regard to both flexibility and accountability, we've been reflective on what we did or didn't do during RTA 1, and are trying to apply those lessons to how RTA Next would be implemented if it was passed by voters.
That's exactly what we've done. And I think credit to the board, quite frankly, because the board recognizing challenges. And basically one of my first challenges, so the challenge to me was, we need you to dissect this, be very open, be critical if necessary, but we want to know how best to address some of these things that we've observed, and how do we make it better? How do we give that internal, and we'll call it memorialized or codified process, that it doesn't matter if you sit in the board chairs or in my chair, that this will be what the process is going forward. And so these have actually been memorialized and codified in the administrative code. That's a part of the regional transportation plan.
So final question, but it's a big one. Because I like getting into the weeds of this stuff, I probably should have asked this question before I got into some of the more specific questions that we just talked about. But where can people go to get more information about RTA Next, and what are the various components of the plan that's going to core voters?
Sure. So first of all, rtanext.com. You can go and there's a lot of information. We've actually done some podcasts ourselves to educate people. We've really gone into the weeds, and we would encourage people to listen to those. Ours aren't, I don't think they're video. Well, they are sort of, but not like yours. But that's one spot. I will tell you that anytime they can send a email with an email address there, happy to answer questions, happy to go down in whatever detail there is. But I think what's important here, there's a couple pieces that I want to make sure are clear. The way that the structure for this conversation works, we have 2 questions that are going to be on the ballot, and that's by statute. You know, everybody asks me, like, why do you have 2 questions? They better have one. Trust me, I challenged that. I really wanted us to have one, but statutes required 2. One of them, Proposition 418, is for the plan. So that's the regional transportation plan for the next 20 years. That's Proposition 418. 419 is the tax. That's the continuation of the same tax rate that folks are paying today. And that's an opportunity for them to give us thumbs up or thumbs down on continuing to fund that regional transportation plan. So when you start to look at the macro level, both of those need to be addressed, both of those need to pass in order for this to continue the way we discussed here. Now let's talk about the plan itself. So we'll start with the roadway corridor element, and I'm going to call them element. There's 5. The roadway corridor element includes roadway improvements. People have asked about the chemistry of the original RTA to this RTA. I can tell you there's 8 projects that have capacity or lane additions. There's 23 projects that don't. There's 23 projects that are basically to upgrade aging infrastructure. They do provide opportunity for added bike lanes, for pedestrian facilities, and I really think that difference, that diversity, speaks to the diversity of the region as a whole, because the urban core has certain needs that are not seen necessarily out in suburban areas. Well, we have a regional plan, and the diversity in that plan is reflected, or the diversity of those needs is reflected.
And just to interject, I'm certain that most of our listeners and viewers don't know this, but Pima County is one of the 20 largest counties in the country.
Absolutely.
It is. And I think it's right around 9,200 square miles. So certainly there are elements of what people often call sprawl in an area that grew so much during the 70s, 80s, 90s. But it's also just a very big place and an extraordinarily diverse place as well.
And the other piece that oftentimes folks don't think about is just the sheer number of lots that are platted, that are currently titled across the entire county. And so somehow those have to be addressed. So again, the roadway element, the corridor element is the 7 projects that I mentioned. So that's the, we'll call it the RTA 1 projects that are included, 5 rescope, 2 additional money. And then 31 additional projects, 8 of which are lane or capacity, and 23 of which we refer to as modernization, but that confuses folks. Just think of it as upgrading aging infrastructure. That's the easiest way to think about it. So the second one is, again, road related, but a direct reflection of the feedback we got from the public. And so folks look at the plan and say, well, it looks the same as what I did before. Actually, it's pretty different. And the biggest difference is in pavement rehabilitation. There's $177 million allocated for pavement rehabilitation. Now, I will tell you that is not going to be pothole filling. Right? You're not going to go out there and see an RTA crew filling a pothole. What you are going to see is new pavements in areas that have failing pavement, quite frankly. The key, though, is that pavement, my engineer hat has to have a 10-year life. So this is not going out and putting a chip seal or some kind of surface treatment. This is actually a reconstruction plan. And that was a direct reflection of commentary that we received from the public, which I think is a piece that I want to make sure I emphasize. So the third element is transit. And by the way, priorities are just I'm thinking about. Sure. So the third element is transit. There's $726 million in the plan for transit, and that is enhancement to the fixed routes, but also, as I mentioned before, the paratransit dial-a-ride. And I know in District 1, the paratransit and dial-a-ride are extremely important, varying to folks. And so this continues that funding and enhances it, enhances those services. But there's also another $258 million, I believe it is, that's leveraged by that investment, that $726 million, for almost $1 billion in transit investment, which is very significant. And by the way, I know you know this, part of that comes from the maintenance effort money paid by Pima County. And so when you look at the transit plan, very, very significant in terms of the investment that we're making to region. The other element is safety, ADA, and active transportation. As you know, active transportation is, in my opinion, a fancy way of saying bike and ped. Non-motorized type vehicular, or non-motorized movement of people, goods, and services. And so we have about $254 million allocated for that purpose. And keep in mind, we have statistics. We now know that the investments, particularly in HOCs, or the on-demand crosswalks, which drive a lot of folks crazy, right? Because when you're driving along, all of a sudden, slide comes down the middle of the block, or at least the middle of the road, and you're thinking, what are we doing here? We'll keep people safe. We actually have a study that there's a 50% reduction in pedestrian crashes because of those. I mean, 50%. We know and recognize that safety is a huge concern, and it sounds like there's only this little tiny piece of investment for safety. I would beg to differ. I believe that the entirety of the plan, that $2.67 billion, is for safety. It really is intended to enhance the safety across the region and address it in a variety of ways.
And I will tell you, as a former K-12 educator, any principal would want a hawk signal near their campus.
Or right across the street. Yeah. Exactly. Absolutely. And so, again, I focus on the safety of the program as a whole. That really is the underlying foundational to everything that the PDL plan stands for. The last one is environmental. So there's $50 million allocated for environmental or wildlife linkages. And so this was a real interesting element in terms of how it came about, but also the conversations that we've heard since then. And so initially it was, we want to make sure that we have wildlife linkages corridors for the wildlife, just like we have for people using the transportation system. And so oftentimes people think of, well, fencing or bridges, maybe get wildlife. There's one up north, actually, it's in District 1 up near.
Named after my late predecessor and dad.
Yes, exactly. And so, people think of that. But I would take it a step further and remind folks that as we went out and started talking to people about the plan, folks really focused on that and said, this is great, because we obviously are concerned about the safety of the wildlife and the animals. We're also concerned about those hits, because our kids, our grandkids, drive late at night. I drive late at night, and we have to be careful because it's not only for their safety, but for our safety. We can separate that. And one of the things that we've actually done, and I believe in on Latoya is a great example of it in District 1 as well, is the enhancement or the expansion of drainage culverts to make sure that they're big enough to allow wildlife to cross under the roads. And so they're drainage, but we're actually oversizing them so that there can be wildlife passage under the roadway and not have those conflicts within the road.
Wonderful. I want everybody to know that Mike, Mr. Ortega, has a significant sheaf of notes in front of him that he's never had to look at throughout this conversation.
My life. Thank you, Sue.
All right.
My life.
Anything that we didn't talk about that you want to cover? I mean, you and I enjoy these issues. I'm jealous of Supervisor Hines that he gets to nerd out on them now, but we could probably talk for a long time. But anything of immediate import that we didn't talk about?
Well, and I'll give a quick shout out to your colleague, Supervisor Hines. I mean, he's really engaged, and enjoy working with him as well. And doing a great job at representing Pima County. I guess what I would leave you with is this. When I talk about the funding, right, I didn't get into the numbers. I can. When you look at the amount of money that we would generate locally with the continuation of the HACCP sales tax, it's about $125 million. When you look at the regional money, it's about $54 million. So when you look at the dollars that are necessary or that we have potentially available to us to improve the transportation system, if we do not extend or do not continue with the sales tax, that basically reduces it by 2/3. So 2/3 of that funding goes away. And I think what's important there is not just that piece, but also when you look at state and federal funding, there's strings attached, as you know. We can't use those monies for all of our transportation. We can only use it for something with no such strings. When the voters give us authorization for that $125 to $126 million, we're investing in ourselves as a region. And the voters dictate the rules. They dictate what those monies can be used for. That's very powerful and very important in comparison to other monies that might come into the region that have strings that basically change with federal or even state administration. And so I leave that to you because I didn't touch on that, but I thought it was important
Very.
to mention.
Very. Well, rtanext.com so that you can find out all the information that's important to you so that you can make an informed decision. Ballots are going to be mailed out on February 11th. I believe they're due back on March 10th.
That's correct.
And we really appreciate Mike Ortega, the time that you've shared with us today. Thank you so much.
Chief Supervisor.
All right.
And a quick shout out to your elections department who's running that election.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you to them as well.
And we will have Constance Hargrove from the Elections Department on this podcast at some point. And thank you all for listening or watching.